This is an RNZ podcast.
This is Media Watch. I'm Colin Peacock in the beating heart of the nation's capital, Wellington, and with me today for this one, Hayden Donnell is in Auckland in the Big Smoke. G'day, Hayden.
G'day, Colin.
So you're happy to do this the usual way as a kind of podcast, or would you prefer that we had done things differently, maybe written open letters to each other instead?
I'm one of the nation's leading opponents of the open letter format, but I do see basically my entire life as an open letter to you, Colin.
Fair enough. Good to have that on the record. But now, do you remember the campaign for the last election and the one before that? The big political parties made big claims in the media about billion-dollar deep holes in each other's policies, and that made it harder for voters to get the whole truth.
How big is his hole? And do...
In a minute, Hayden will tell us why we might have to brace for more of that in 2026. And also, TVNZ says it's now planning to check itself for bias. But we begin today with COVID-19 and our national response to it. How did our media respond to another Royal Commission into that going public this week?
It is public because it is live streamed with no delay and no restrictions on viewing, and because media are present in the hearing room. Commissioners, council, media, commission and technical staff and witnesses are all together in one hearing room in Auckland. Some witnesses will attend by Zoom link, so it is a public hearing of its time.
That was Barrister Nicolette Levy KC last Monday, introducing the first day of public hearings in the Royal Commission of Inquiry into COVID-19, the second such inquiry looking into the government's response into the pandemic and its effects. Now, this inquiry zeroes in on the impact of the extended lockdown in Auckland and Northland in 2021 and on vaccine mandates and safety, and it is a hearing of its time in more ways than just the technology she was talking about there. It's also of its time in terms of post-COVID politics. For a start, the inquiry was on this week because New Zealand First demanded it when forming the coalition government in 2023. And that's why the second phase opened with new commissioners and expanded terms of reference. And that meant that fringe voices opposed to vaccine mandates, and in some cases the vaccine itself, as well as experts and representatives of councils, community and business groups, would be heard this time. And heard, but not cross-examined. Nicolette Levy made it plain that this inquiry must be a non-adversarial process. But there was some pushback to that in the media. On the dawn of day one, Ryan Bridge kicked off NZME's streaming show Herald Now like this.
It's the big one. The Royal Inquiry into the COVID response kicks off this morning. It looks at lockdowns. It looks at all of the things you hated most.
But in the polarised world of COVID, the haters hated different things. For example, asthmatic Annie Collins told the inquiry on the first day, lockdown worked pretty well, she thought. It saved lives. It was vaccine misinformation that was the real problem for her.
I think that was a major flaw in our system. And the way that people got treated, like Dr. Wiles and Jacinda, all those social media streams should have been blocked. They were disgusting and they were basically lies.
Well, shutting down social media channels was a bit out of scope for this inquiry, but the inquiry chair, Grant Illingworth KC, told Ryan Bridge on Monday the big decisions made at the time were certainly in scope. And last Monday, the Herald Now host pressed the inquiry chair about getting those who called the shots out in public, including Jacinda Ardern.
Why wouldn't you put her on the list? She made all the big calls.
Well, there are issues in relation to our powers when people are out of the country, for example, and those things are being worked through at the moment.
Your powers, even if they were in the country, wouldn't be enough to actually force people to come, or are they?
Yes, they are.
So if Jacinda is out of the country, you can't force her to come?
That's correct.
But if she's in the country, you'd like her to come?
If she's in the country, we will consider her position.
But an invitation was not enough for Ryan Bridge.
Why won't you be fair, open and transparent and open with us this morning?
Well, we will be fair, open and transparent at the appropriate time.
Well, that response was misinterpreted by many in the media that day as meaning that Jacinda Ardern had been asked to attend and either hadn't responded or that the chair wouldn't say if she had or not. And that awkward encounter with the chair, Grant Illingworth, ended like this.
You couldn't have someone deported to come back, could you, Grant?
No.
No, okay. Powerful, but not that powerful.
Not that powerful.
All right, Grant, thanks very much. Grant Elling.
Now, deportation is, of course, kicking people out of the country, not dragging them back in. But later in the show, Brian Bridges' panel guest Rawdon Christie, a former TVNZ breakfast host who's now a real estate agent, backed the idea.
Do you think that they should have the power to do that?
100%.
Extradite them?
Do you really want to get into like international treaty law though? Like extradition treaties?
Yes,
That's going to be a whole bunch of... It's like, you think the Commerce Commission reports on banking cost a lot, man.
True. I think there'd be a bit of appetite for it though.
The Deputy Prime Minister was at pains, though, to point out that the inquiry is an independent one and it should do what it needs to do about that. And the next day, that was the reason the Health Minister during the COVID crisis, Chris Hipkins, gave to Morning Report for not giving a view on Ardern's attendance.
They have reached out to her. Do you think it's useful for that inquiry to hear those comments?
The inquiry operates independently, and I think that that's important that they continue to do that. So I'm not going to tell them who they should and shouldn't hear from.
And on Ryan Bridges' Herald Now show that day, Chris Hipkins said he is cooperating with the inquiry, though he equivocated on whether he himself would appear before it in August. But then he made it clear he really didn't fancy what he thought had become a bit of a political process.
And the fact that the terms of reference
think it's a witch
specifically, well, the terms of reference specifically exclude decisions made when New Zealand First were part of the government. So I think the terms of reference have been deliberately constructed to achieve a particular outcome, particularly around providing a platform for those who have conspiracy theorists' views. That seems to have been specifically written into the terms of reference that they get maximum airtime.
Yeah, do you know why?
And some of what he called conspiracy theorists given a platform at this inquiry had, Chris Hipkins pointed out, actually built platforms for gallows outside Parliament during that occupation in 2022 with his name on them. Now, one of the groups that prompted that occupation was the anti-vaccine, anti-lockdown group Voices for Freedom, and they did appear at the inquiry on Thursday to be heard.
Past. I mean, gosh, it was nearly 5 years ago now that we were talking about all of this stuff. But
do you seriously expect the people of New Zealand to accept that the deaths that were being reported internationally were not genuinely from COVID?
Well, we're not disputing that there are not people. We've answered that question, that there were deaths. We're simply saying that it gets very complex, especially when people are being funded in order to tick a box to say that a death was COVID, caused by COVID.
And Voices for Freedom is still pursuing top politicians and public servants. They even flew a plane over Auckland last week promoting a campaign called Face the Music, calling on the inquiry's commissioners to summon Jacinda Ardern and others to appear as witnesses and, in their words, hold them accountable for their COVID abuse. Their online petition is illustrated with a pencil sketch depicting the former Prime Minister, Chris Hipkins and Sir Ashley Bloomfield, all shoulder to shoulder in a courtroom dock. Not exactly in tune with the evidence-gathering and non-adversarial approach demanded of this Royal Commission Part 2. So while the angst and some anger about the COVID response clearly persists for some, how did the media cover the inquiry hearing over 4 days this week? Well, in the end, there wasn't much. After a hiss and a roar on Monday, when it got underway, it was barely there on major news outlets afterwards. On Tuesday, for example, it was well down the running orders of morning and evening news shows alike, long after coverage of the mushroom murder trial in Australia, and again on Wednesday, after the possibility of Moa regenerated with the backing of Sir Peter Jackson. And that included stuff on Wednesday, which did carry an opinion piece and video by TFN show host Patrick Gower.
It is actually bizarre that we are having a COVID inquiry without Dame Jacinda's participation. She owes it to Kiwis to front.
Well, that was triggered by another piece of stuff content, Sir Ian Taylor's open letter to Jacinda Ardern last weekend, accusing her of turning her back on the nation of 5 million for what he called a waka of one. But on Wednesday, TVNZ One News did report this.
No mai hoki mai. Former Prime Minister Dame Jacinda Ardern says she'll provide evidence to the COVID-19 inquiry if asked to. Her spokesperson told The Post that discussions were ongoing about the best way for it to occur.
And the Capital's daily paper did indeed have that story. But that's the same story it's been from as long ago as March, when the inquiry issued a minute that made it clear that it could not take what it called a legalistic or adversarial approach. Regarding interviews with decision makers, the Minute said the commissioners expect that individuals will be prepared to attend interviews with them and or officers of the inquiry on a voluntary basis. The interviews may be conducted online or in person, the Minute said, recorded and may be transcribed for the public record. So much as some being heard this week say they wanted to see and hear those they opposed in the dock, almost literally, in person, the terms of the inquiry never guaranteed that. So, Hayden, as we heard there, not a whole lot of coverage of the inquiry itself, which ran live online and in public. Does it surprise you there wasn't much appetite for coverage, or maybe even appetite amongst the public to read and hear about it?
Not really. Honestly, I remember during COVID, at the tail end of the height of the COVID pandemic, Stuff put out a memo to all of its staff saying, you need to pull back on the COVID stories. People are losing interest. Obviously, there is a section of the community that is still very focused and intent on the response, and it's something that they're passionate about. But I think the wider public probably just tired of it, honestly.
But the coverage that there was related to this, so much of it was actually about not what was said, but about whether Jacinda Ardern would or should appear. And yet, as we heard there, the rules haven't changed. Back in March, they set out the terms for the inquiry, and it was clear that in August, like not now, there will be sessions where decision makers will be asked questions. Do you think that Sir Ian Taylor open letter was maybe a reason for that? Because that was a clickable hit for Stuff.
I doubt it. The media probably just got the wrong end of the stick with that Grant Illingworth interview, and perhaps there's more of a focus on Jacinda Ardern again, but that was always going to be the case with the inquiry going on. Ian Taylor did level some pretty harsh criticism, so maybe there's, from the vaccine skeptics and the people who are still bitter about lockdowns, there's more of an impetus to talk about how Jacinda should be appearing. I don't know whether it influenced the media, though. I think there's probably just mainly misunderstanding.
Did it fall between the cracks a bit for media because it didn't get the full attention and energy of the press gallery? They were a bit more focused on the Regulatory Standards Bill hearings that were going on at the same time. So maybe not seen as strictly a politics story, and that meant that there wasn't as much as you'd expect.
From something that primarily happened 5 years ago, and it's talking about ways that we could make improvements in future, whereas the Regulatory Standards Bill is something that will impact the nation directly in the immediate terms. So you can see their reasoning there. This is, for all of the controversy around COVID, primarily an academic exercise in trying to improve a public health response, and that might not be as sexy and clickable for the media as something that is current.
With that in mind, interesting opinion piece on Newsroom by vaccinologist Helen Pertusis-Harris, co-director of the Global Vaccine Data Network. She said, this inquiry, it will examine how trust was won, lost and exploited. The rise of misinformation and targeted disinformation isn't just a curious byproduct of the pandemic era. It's a feature of our new public health landscape. If we don't address it, we're inviting history to repeat itself. Any future pandemic, we actually need to be prepared for the kind of opposition that we've been hearing from groups like Voices for Freedom, etc.
That point that this is a permanent part of the landscape now is a good one. You can now just get your messages out there on social media. Social media's algorithms prioritize things based on engagement rather than their veracity, their truth. And that can lead to false claims, partisan, ultra-partisan claims, and emotive but wrong or dangerous claims getting elevated over fact-checked stuff. And I don't want to say, oh, well, the media is the ultimate arbiter of truth, but at least the media has some systems in place. And when it did put out information, it was generally edited and there was an expectation that it would be true. That's less and less the case. So yes, I think she's right there.
Well, the aspect of the inquiry that did get a little bit more coverage than others was Thursday, which was where the people worried about, vaccine efficacy and the rollout and all of that got spoken to, as well as anti-conspiracy theory group FACT, and immunologist Graham LeGros. He was spoken to at the end of the day. And it was interesting to hear the founders of Voices for Freedom, for example, quizzed by QCs about this, because they wanted to be heard, and to be heard in the form of awkward questions for them from a KC was pretty interesting. But Helen Petousis-Harris also said the public health messaging at the start was lauded globally for its clarity and its empathy, the black and yellow stuff. Then she says, look, as time goes by, the messaging was increasingly centralised and inflexible. We need tailored communications. More nuance and dialogue was needed. The approach defaulted to broadcast rather than engagement. What was thought to be brilliant and effective at the start, ended up being a problem.
It's possibly a both and, where you need the individual messaging to communities, and you also, just for the sake of actually communicating things clearly to a public that has limited time and emotional and mental bandwidth, you need to have it just clear and simple. It's interesting with Voices for Freedom, isn't it? What happens when you get people out of their safe space?
And interestingly, Helen Petousis-Harris, who I mentioned there, is on the list of their targets of their Face the Music campaign as a transgressor. But
is that the terminology, transgressor?
Transgressor. She was labelled as one of a list of transgressors in their secondary line of targets. That campaign actually being run, I think, by Reality Check Radio. But interestingly, under the questioning on Thursday, they did actually speak about how closely tied in they were to Reality Check Radio. And indeed, that was one of the reasons for its founding. And that, of course, is ongoing and talks about a whole lot of stuff, as does Voices for Freedom these days, and comment on issues that are actually nothing to do with vaccines, vaccine mandates, or COVID-19. It's become a part of the kind of modern media landscape of New Zealand. But anyhow, some of this will come back again in August when the second phase of the second Royal Commission of Inquiry gets underway, and there will be input of some form from Jacinda Ardern, Chris Hipkins and others. So it'll be interesting to see if this goes all the way through to August. Well, as we mentioned there, one possible reason that the current COVID Royal Commission of Inquiry didn't get so much media coverage is that the hearings into the controversial Regulatory Standards Bill were going on at the same time, and they did get lots of political media attention. But like that COVID inquiry, the bill is also a product of the coalition agreement to form the government back in 2023. This time it was the ACT Party getting its way with the Regulatory Standards Bill. And last week, turns out that at Cabinet, both of the coalition partners also got their way on another matter. ACT and NZ First shot down a proposal to create a body to cost political parties' promises for the 2026 election. Hayden, does it look like we should brace ourselves for about this time next year and a bit, another season of what you've called fiscal hole hunting?
Yes, we should. Brace yourself right now. Just as context, Finance Minister Nicola Willis, she was keen to set up a publicly funded policy costings unit so that political parties could check their election promises and make sure that they stacked up. The Herald's political editor Thomas Coughlan broke the news that the unit had been nixed by ACT and New Zealand First, and ACT's David Seymour went on News Talk ZB to explain why.
What is your problem with the idea?
Well, I think you've got to ask what problems it's solving.
What problems would it be solving? Well, I think probably the answer has something to do with the fact that we've now had 3 consecutive elections dominated by arguments about fiscal holes. Let's go through the tape. There's Bill English talking about Labour's alleged fiscal hole back in 2017.
Well, we believe there's a $11 billion hole there. Now, that's big enough that it could affect families through higher taxes.
Now, that's the original hole, and it was pioneered by Stephen Joyce. Economists later agreed the hole didn't actually exist, but I'll note that Stephen Joyce was on Mike Hosking this week, and he was saying actually the hole was even bigger than he thought it was. So still disputed, I guess. Fast forward to 2020 though, and you've got National's then finance spokesman Paul Goldsmith fronting an awkward fiscal hole-focused press stand-up during the campaign.
Well, thanks for coming along this afternoon. As Grant Robertson helpfully pointed out, we based our fiscal plan on contributions to the super fund based on the budget figures. It turned out there was a slight change with the pre-FU figures, the pre-election fiscal update figures.
Pretty tense. Thanks for coming along. I'm not sure he truly meant that, but he had to concede some things there. Of course, in 2023, we also got dueling fiscal hole allegations. You had Labour and the CTU saying National's tax plan figures had a $1.5 billion hole in them. National, in turn, found an error in Labour's costings in its plan to take GST off fresh fruit and veggies. But the discourse at least gave us a classic Parliament exchange between Nicola Willis and Grant Robertson.
How big is his hole? And
That is not in the public interest, I can assure you.
One of the all-time classic entries into Hansard, that one.
Wouldn't that alone be one reason why we don't want to go back to that or the possibility of that? So you say as a result of what played out in Cabinet last week, we are now looking at, let's say, staring down the barrel of another war of the holes. Is that a mixed metaphor in 2026?
I think that's a weird way of putting it, Colin, honestly, and I don't know who would have scripted that question for you, but that's definitely a point made by interest.co.nz's economic reporter Dan Brunskill, who covered the costings unit backtrack under the headline, "Prepare for another election cycle full of fiscal holes and creative cost estimates after the ACT and New Zealand First parties vetoed Nicola Willis's policy costing unit proposal." And his point is that the lack of a costings unit does a couple of things. For one, it makes it more likely that politicians and political parties are going to put out plans that don't stack up and their opponents are going to find errors, and then that will be a whole thing and the media will go into a whole cycle on holes. But a whole cycle, and two, it puts the onus on the journalists to find those errors, or people like Craig Rennie at the CTU who revelled in it last election.
Yeah, so fiscal fact-checking. But it sounds like Dan Brunskill is lamenting this, but you think also journalists are turned on by having arguments about, $1 billion of holes. It's a good row. I mean, they loved it also in, I think it was 2011, when John Key, with the Show Me the Money thing.
Show Me the Money.
That was in a stuffed debate, like a
Did he say
media
sunshine?
set piece. Yeah, I think he did. And that was a media event. So this is good fodder for journalists, you would have thought, like Dan?
We shouldn't probably just speculate on Dan's mindset. Maybe we should actually just give him a call.
Hello.
Kia ora, Dan. You seem like you're kind of dreading another season of fiscal hole hunting, but is that kind of shooting yourself in the foot? Isn't this good content for journalists?
I'm up for a fiscal hole, but what I'm saying is that the public ought to be dreading it, and that for the good of our country, for the good of the institutions, for the good of the quality of public debate, we should be dreading it.
Yeah, what are the downsides of the fiscal hole discourse, in your opinion?
When someone announces a policy, often the debate will zero in straight away on whether they've correctly estimated the cost. If you're 100% out, if you're 200% out, if you have a really unrealistic costing of your policy, that's a big deal. But if you're 10% off, that's just margin of error. So instead of debating whether this tax policy is a good idea, we debate whether it's been perfectly estimated the cost, instead of debating policy's merits. And then once people discover an error, they use it to sort of imply that the political party is economically illiterate, when we really should be saying, this policy roughly costed, is it a good idea? I think, particularly from opposition, policy proposals are directional, they're aspirational. Opposition parties do not have the resources of government to carefully formulate exact policies. So we should really always be thinking of policy proposals, even as announced, as being rough drafts of government policy that will be formed by experts once elected. If you're estimating it's $1 billion and it's $3 billion, that's a problem. But if you're estimating it's $1 billion and it's 1.2, that doesn't really matter.
Would just out of interest, would the critiques of National's tax plan last election fall into that more substantive territory?
The National Party estimated almost double or triple the amount of revenue that the independent economists thought it would bring in. So that was a wide error. And it was also important because they had promised that policy would be completely neutral. They'd really done a big job of promising that every dollar would be accounted for. So when it wasn't, that's sort of the realm of fiscal hole where you're starting to think it's significant. I mean, there was another one where Labor had their GST of fruit and vegetables, and they had missed by about $70 million because of the start time. It correctly estimated the policy's cost each year, but they'd incorrectly estimated when it would start. And instead of being $500 million a year, it was going to be $570 million a year. I mean, that's a lot of money to forget about, but also it doesn't really matter for the policy during an election campaign.
This might sound hopelessly naive, but is there a call for a kind of media culture change here where collectively we could obsess a little bit less over these particular numbers and elevate the discussion a bit?
I mean, I'm as guilty as anyone in the 2023 campaign of obsessing over all of these estimate costing mistakes. But having reflected on that post-election, I think, the next time I cover an election, I will describe most of these cost estimates to readers as estimates. And it's true of government policy as well. The government announced Family Boost. That was put together by the experts in the departments, but the experts in the departments basically got it wrong, and not as many families were able to access the policy as they thought. So even once you're in government, your estimates are still just estimates.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Pleasure.
Yeah, that was interesting from Dan, but Hayden, surely the same thing would be true for politicians, right? They would want to spend time talking about policy and not necessarily having to stress about the fiscal fact-checking and having to defend this stuff in public from journalists and others and political opponents.
Yeah, that's clearly the case for Nicola Willis, but as she put it, Cabinet decided that the risks of setting up this unit outweighed the rewards, and in interviews, David Seymour's been pretty clear about what he regards those risks to be. So here he is again talking to Heather du Plessis-Allen on Newstalk ZB.
The bureaucracy or the government departments are held in check by New Zealanders going to the polls and voting in elections to change the direction of policy and basically keep them under control. Now, for the bureaucracy to be involved in the very process and effectively become a referee or adjudicator of the very process that is supposed to hold it in check creates a difficult loop constitutionally.
And David Seymour also noted the Act puts out its own alternative budgets every election. It pays for independent costings that everyone pretty much agrees are accurate. So why put that expense on the taxpayer? It should be the political party's responsibility to do that themselves. And that point, at least, won over Heather du Plessis-Allen.
When the whole point of the election is to hold them accountable in the first place.
But also, why would we pay for stuff that you guys as political parties are paying for yourself? You're bearing the cost of your independent costings. I don't want to pay for it.
Don't want to pay for it.
But at ZB, there were alternative opinions?
Kerry Woodham had a very different take on it. She wasn't convinced by the line from ACT about putting out its own costings at all, and she described it like this.
As for ACT saying on, we said no because we already provide a fully costed budget before each election. Ugh, stop being so smarmy and teachers petty. You can't mark your own homework.
You can't mark your own homework. I mean, they might dispute that. Technically, it's independent economists marking their homework. You're a big fan of John McDonald on Canterbury Mornings as well, aren't you?
Well, I used to work with him years ago in the UK. That is just a coincidence. His take was something like snake oil promises have been given a lifeline by this costings unit being cut out.
Yes, exactly.
How different things would be. Just imagine it. How different things would be, eh? If all of these brilliant vote-catching ideas were put through the ringer by an independent, publicly funded agency, how better informed we would all be. But also how careful the politicians would be too, before they sold us snake oil policies that quite often we end up regretting falling for.
John McDonald there almost channeling as John Lennon, imagine there's an parliamentary publicly funded costings unit.
The costings. I dreamed a dream of public costings where policy was properly assessed. Yeah, good to see a plurality of opinion at NZME, fulfilling new board member Jim Grennan's commitment to improved balance. And you have to say there is a a general diversity of opinion on the right on this issue. Obviously, there's Nicola Willis. There's also the right-leaning economist Eric Crampton, who's spoken up in favour of a costings unit idea. So it's not just a unified view here.
Well, you mentioned Stephen Joyce had appeared on ZB talking about this. He was in the middle of a fiscal hole row 2017. What was his view on it when he talked to Mike Hosking? Did he think a costings unit was good or bad?
He raised a point that I hadn't really thought of with a political costings unit, and that's that the government holds all the cards when it comes to political costings, and they can use their advantage against their opposition. And this is how he put it.
The problem that happens when you're in opposition is that you don't have access to the information. So you have to go chasing around OIAs and parliamentary questions to try and get enough information to build a policy which stands scrutiny when it gets out in the public. And it's a lot of fun for the government of the day to try and withhold all that information and then go, it's a ridiculously costed policy.
Yeah, he says fun for the government to be able to give the opposition the runaround, but no fun for the media.
No fun for the public.
Well, no, but you're saying for Dan, this puts the onus on journalists to do the fiscal fact-checking. Do we know if the media is ready, willing and able to actually do that?
The answer is sort of. Sometimes there's good reporting, there's bad reporting. I think the main issue that arose last election, and it's something that I commented on, was that we sometimes focus on the political marketing of these promises, these financial promises, over the substance of them. And so we saw last election, National put out this $250 a fortnight tax cut proposal that they put on billboards across the country, and the media was sceptical about it, but a lot of the analysis was kind of giving them some adulation for the marketing job they did. So this is 3's Jenna Lynch.
This is a masterclass in political marketing. National has taken what is, in reality, a $25 a week tax cut for most middle earners, doubled it into a couple, doubled it into a fortnight, slapped their childcare subsidy in there, and all of a sudden they have a $250 figure to slap all over the billboards.
To be fair to her, she is being sceptical there. She is communicating the reality. I think there might have been an element of irony or sarcasm in that. But I do take issue with sometimes framing these promises as a masterclass in political marketing, because that might encourage parties to engage in more political marketing, which is otherwise known as spin. I thought the media's job was cutting through the spin column.
Indeed. But yeah, as Dan was warning, we might be bracing ourselves for another spin cycle around fiscal holes a little over a year from now, not that far away, election 2026. Well, as we heard earlier in the program, the New Zealand First Party pushed for another Royal Commission of Inquiry into COVID after the election in 2023, but they also went into that election with a strident call in their manifesto for a Royal Commission of Inquiry into something else, which was media bias and manipulation in New Zealand. We've clearly biased media in New Zealand, conditioned now to publish what they believe is true, not what is fact, the manifesto said. But evidently, this inquiry was not a bottom line for forming a government. It didn't end up in the coalition agreement. And it seems that support isn't exactly surging into the online petition on the party's website. 2 years after launching it, we had a look this week, and there are 3 signatures on that petition for a Royal Commission of Inquiry into media bias. But last week, it was revealed that TVNZ will have its own independent review looking at bias and balance in its own output. And when I say this was revealed, it was only really mentioned in brief. This is in TVNZ's latest statement of performance expectations covering the next financial year up to June 2026. This is the document, of course, that the TVNZ Board of Directors is obliged to submit and make public. Published only in the corporate section of TVNZ's website, Business Desk picked it up. It also says, interestingly, it will provide additional training for all editorial staff on trust and constantly monitor for the separation of fact and opinion, with additional signposting for viewers. But interesting also whether this is a response to ministerial pressure for more trust and transparency. RNZ has had the same sort of message from the Minister, Paul Goldsmith. He wrote a letter to TVNZ's chair in March saying, "We continue to expect that TVNZ preserves and enhances its reputation as a trusted Crown-owned media company, reflecting values and serving the public interest." And turns out RNZ used an expert for its review of editorial practices after that Russia editing controversy in 2023. TVNZ will be using the same guy, Alan Sunderland, a former ABC, Australia and SBS News executive. Interesting though, Hayden, that we've got a minister who is, in formal expressions of instruction to its state-owned broadcasters, calling on them to be more trusted and demonstrate it. But at the same time, other members of his government not quite expressing the same sort of confidence in state-owned media.
You get these calls to improve trust, but then you have YouTube channels from ACT in particular, New Zealand First sometimes put stuff out as well, where they film all their interviews and then post them on social media with headlines, David Seymour owns the media, David Seymour takes on sort of shifty media. And that's framing the media as the enemy, trying to undermine trust in it. And you could say, well, look, some of these videos they're completely unedited, but that framing of them does undermine people's trust in the media at the same time that the government is putting out all of these calls for the media to improve its trust. And I don't know if it's mixed messaging or if one belies the other.
Paul Goldsmith's letter to TVNZ in March said, "We appreciate that it is consistently TVNZ considered one of New Zealand's most trusted media organisations and is supported by editorial and operational independence arrangements." That's not the same message David Seymour gave in his fundraising ACT Party stuff, saying we need your money to support our own media channels. Very different. In that statement of performance expectations, by the way, TVNZ published last week, 3 complaints upheld by TVNZ, the BSA or the Media Council out of 2,633. So vanishingly small number of complaints upheld. Yeah, and there are now more of these trust surveys than previously. So, I guess their review of bias and all of that will feed into it. So there's a body of evidence they can present to a minister or any politician giving them a hard time about their trustworthiness. A couple of other things in that document. They're targeting 1 million viewers of the online service by 2030 and digital advertising reaching 150 million the same year. It's about 55 million now. So quite a bit to do to triple that in 6 years. Now, finally this week, last week on Midweek Media Watch, Hayden, you were chatting to Emile Donovan about Mike Hosking on ZB going all sort of Frenchified, using the word frisson a lot, ironically when he was pressing Erica Stanford about the, in his words, Maorification of education. So with that in mind, how did you feel about the Otago Daily Times using its front page headline last Monday, "Un nuit fantastique," to describe the All Blacks test win over France?
I should just say c'est la vie, but I can't take it, Colin.
So you're not happy. Well, what about then deploying fake French accents? Because on Emile's Night's program on RNZ National in his chat with Jamie Wall about the test match, he was talking about speaking with a team of 4 from the French sports paper L'Equipe was in Dunedin to cover the test, and he said one of them had said this to him about his impressions of Dunedin.
This town, she feels like a widow. She has lost her glory, her beauty, and she knows she will never get it back to find another. Wow.
About the city of Dunedin.
How do you feel about that? A New Zealand sports journalist not only recounting a quote from a French journalist, but actually impersonating the accent.
You know what, Colin? That was a pretty good job. I actually, I got a frisson of excitement when I heard that. I was ready to go in on Jamie there, but I think that he did a good job.
Yeah, I'm going to say impersonations are fine. I think it's even courageous to do that. But in his RNZ match review, I do note that on the RNZ website, Jamie Wall called the match a pretty unique test match. But something's either unique or it's not. But look, that's just... but the other gift the French language has given the English language media worldwide is a range of terms that only the media use for fighting or disagreement. There's melee, fracas, Yeah, contretemps is the other one for that's usually for a political disagreement. So French is the language of friction, and that is a gift for the media.
Absolutely. Maybe I'm coming round on this.
Okay, we'll work on dropping some more French-ification to add a bit of frisson to your output on Media Watch in the future.
This is Media Watch. Je m'appelle Hayden Donnell.
Well, that's it for this weekend. He was Hayden Donnell. Thanks for listening. I'm Colin Peacock, and Hayden will be back again with Midweek Media Watch next Wednesday, mercredi, at about 8:30 on Nights with Emile Donovan. Won't you, Hayden?
That's right, Colin. I will be providing a frisson of media commentary at exactly that time, as you say, 8:30 on Wednesday evening.
And if it goes badly, there'll be a bit of a contretemps or
maybe a fracas.
Fracas will break out. That's it for this weekend. Thanks for listening. If you have any thoughts for us or ideas for us to follow up, do get in touch. Doesn't need to be in French. Email us at rnz.co.nz. You'll also find us at Media Watch NZ on X, and you can even write us an old-fashioned letter and send it to P.O. Box 123, Wellington. I'll be back. Hayden will be back next Wednesday with Midweek Media Watch, as we said. Catch you then. In the meantime, follow Media Watch and listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any podcast app to make sure you never miss an episode.